don't forget to turn in your questions, because I need them. This is something that I started to do when I was preaching in Johnson City, Tennessee, several years ago. It was a rather popular study, Brethren Look Forward. I called it Ask Your Preacher Night there, but I really like What Is Written better. But it was a study that brethren look forward to. In fact, there was one fellow in the congregation, he would come in and is tonight Ask Your Preacher Night? It's something that I have enjoyed doing. I hope that it is something that you will enjoy and profit from. And so we're going to look at all kinds of Bible questions. Hopefully, you'll give me some easy ones once in a while, but I'm not going to shy away from the more difficult questions. But let me say that your question needs to be clearly stated or written. And I might reword your question if I think I can maybe make it a little bit clearer, but it will be very helpful to me if you state or write your question as clearly as you can. We've got some ground rules here. I'm not interested in pot shot questions. You understand what I mean? Questions designed to ambush the preacher or ambush one of the members. That's not what this is about. All right? So let's try to avoid that. Our goal will be to offer biblical, wise, and timely answers. We'll try to cover 1 to 5 questions in the period. That's probably overly optimistic. And how many questions we cover will depend upon the nature of the question. In some study periods, we may be able to answer several. In others, we may only be able to answer one question. It may take some time. If you asked me about the eschatological significance of the flight pattern of left-handed angels. Okay, I'm glad you laughed. You were supposed to. But some questions are more difficult than others. And so it may very well be that we'll only look at one particular question in one particular study period. Because, as I've already said, some questions will require more time for me to answer, more time for me to prepare. And so, if you hand me a question, I may not be able to address that question at the next What Is Written study. It may require more preparation than that, so please be patient. Sensitive questions, we're going to try to answer those as carefully as we can. And so, this morning, since I kind of sprung this on you, I had mentioned this in the men's business meeting, that's something that I thought I wanted to do at some point. I didn't decide to do this until earlier this week, since we're starting a new year and a new worship schedule. I thought, well, this would be a good time to start this study. And so, we're going to look at some questions that I have received in the past. And here's our first question. Where did Cain get his wife? How many of you think I don't want you to respond verbally, but you might raise your, how many of you think you know the answer to that question? Raise your hands. Holly, Kathy, okay, several of you think you know the answer to that. I'm sure you do. But if you'll look at Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, the text says, Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden, where some of my brethren go when I'm preaching. And Cain knew his wife, And she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Well, there's several things that I think can help us answer this particular question. First of all, the passage that I just read said that Cain knew, and of course it's talking about a sexual knowledge. He had a sexual relationship with his wife. It says he knew her, not that he found her in the land of Nod. Then look over at Genesis chapter 5 and verse 4. There Moses says of Adam, after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. So Adam and Eve had other unnamed children. We know about Cain and Abel and Seth, but they had other children as well. Now turn back to Genesis chapter 3 and look at verse 20. There the text says, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now obviously, that means that Eve was the mother of all living humans. If you remember the creation account in Genesis 1, there were animals that were created by God before Adam and Eve came along. And that text says that life begets after its kind, and so obviously Eve is the mother of all living humans. And so, what's our conclusion? Where did Cain get his wife? Well, when you consider this information, I think the only conclusion you can draw is that he must have married one of his sisters. And so I think that's the answer to that particular question. Another question that I received quite often when I was preaching in Tennessee, it just kept coming up and coming up. I don't know if that meant I didn't do a very good job of answering it the first time. But folks wanted to know, how do we know? That's not the question that I was expecting. Okay, well, I've got two different versions of this file on this laptop and this laptop. So, strike what I just said. Back up, take two. How do we know that Jesus was raised on Sunday? Well, turn in your New Testaments to Luke chapter 24. Because I think that this is the passage that clearly shows that Jesus was raised on the first day of the week. I want you to notice what Luke writes in the first verse. He says, now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. So, the women come to the tomb on the first day of the week to finish preparing Jesus' body, which incidentally is an indication that they weren't expecting a resurrection. They thought Jesus was going to be in the tomb. Look down to verse 7. Luke says, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. I should have backed up to verse 6, because that tells us that Jesus had predicted earlier, on an earlier occasion, that he would be raised on the third day. Now then, look down to verse 13. Two men are walking along the road on the way to Emmaus. Verse 13 says, "Now behold, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus." So what day is that? Well, that's the first day of the week, right? All right, now then, look down to verse 21. Jesus joins these two men as they're walking along. If you'll remember, they do not recognize who he is. But verse 21 says, and this is something that they're saying to Jesus as they're walking along, "But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened." Now, when did Jesus say he would be raised? He said he would be raised on the third day. These two men are traveling to Emmaus on the first day of the week, and they say this is the third day. Now, look down to verse 46. Later on, Jesus is explaining to the apostles how it was necessary for him to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. And he says, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day." Now then, if you'll flip over to Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 16 and verse 9, Mark writes, "Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons." Now you might wonder, well, Kevin, why didn't you just go to Mark 16:9? Well, you may notice in the margin of your Bible that Mark 16:9 through the end of the chapter is not found in some of the oldest Greek manuscripts, and that's a whole nother study. But we don't have to go to Mark 16:9. Luke 24, I think, clearly indicates that Jesus was raised on the first day of the week. Well, a related question. How long was Jesus in the tomb? Well, the fact of the matter is, Jesus' entombment, I don't know if that's a word or not, but if it's not, I made it up, is described in different ways by the gospel writers. Some passages say that Jesus would be raised in 3 days. Others say that he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Several passages say that he would be raised on the third day, within 3 days, after 3 days. The Jewish leaders wanted a guard to protect the tomb until the third day, they say in Matthew 27:64. When Peter preached to the household of Cornelius, he said that Jesus was raised on the third day. So I want you to notice that the entombment of Jesus, as I've just said, is described in different ways. And this chart is designed to show you that sometimes different terminology is used in parallel accounts. For example, Matthew says that he would be raised the third day. In the parallel account in Mark said after 3 days. So you've got that kind of thing going on. In Matthew 26:61, Matthew says he would be raised in 3 days. Mark says within 3 days. Here Matthew says after 3 days. Here until the third day. So again, I'm saying the same thing that I've just said with these charts as well. Well, look at Matthew chapter 27. Because Matthew tells us that Jesus died about the 9th hour of the day. In verse 45, he says, "Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land, and about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then if you'll look down to verse 50, Matthew says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." So shortly after, Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And that was at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He died. Matthew indicates that Jesus was buried at even. Look down to verse 57. "Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus." You remember the rest of that particular part of the story. Other passages clearly tell us that Jesus was buried on the preparation day, which was the day before the Sabbath. Look over to Mark chapter 15 and begin reading with me in verse 42. "Now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath." So that's Friday. Jesus was buried on Friday, shortly before the Sabbath began. So this was the preparation day of the Sabbath, and John tells us in John 19 that that Sabbath was a high day. That was a special Sabbath because it was during the Passover feast. He was in the tomb all of Saturday. In Luke chapter 23 and in verse 56, Luke says, "Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment." And then, as we've already noted from Luke 24, Jesus was raised early on Sunday morning. Well, you've got late Friday afternoon, he's buried. All day Saturday, he's raised early on Sunday morning. What about those 3-day business? He's going to be in the tomb for 3 days. Well, it all relates to how the Jews counted time. They would count part of a day as a whole day. Ellison, in the New International Bible Commentary, says, "In biblical and rabbinic time reckoning, part of a period is reckoned as a whole period." Rabbi Elazar, who lived around 8100, a little bit after the time of Christ, said, "A day and a night make an ona," a 24-hour period, "and the portion of an ona is reckoned as an ona." Eric Lyon says in the first century, any part of a day could be computed for the whole day and the night following it. Let me skip those. We see evidence of this in other passages. I'm not going to take the time to turn to these other passages, but notice that Genesis 42 verse 17 says that Joseph's brothers were imprisoned for 3 days by Joseph. But Joseph spoke to them on the 3rd day. You see the point? Obviously, this imprisonment was not for 3 full days. What is that, 72 hours? The chronicler tells us in 2 Chronicles 10 verse 5 that Israel was to return after 3 days. But just a few verses later, it says they return on the 3rd day. Well, now, the way we would tend to reckon time, if you return after 3 days, you would return on what day? The 4th day, right? That would be after 3 days, 3 full days. Well, that's just not the way the Jews reckoned time. So after 3 days is consistent with them returning on the 3rd day. 1 Samuel 30 verse 12, we read about an Egyptian that had not eaten for 3 days and 3 nights. But then later we're told that he fell sick 3 days ago. 3 days and 3 nights is equal to 3 days here. Esther, before she went into the king to inform him about Haman's plot to exterminate the Jews, she asked her people to fast, not to eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. But then, in the next chapter, we're told that she went into the king on the 3rd day. So the Jews would reckon a part of a day as an entire day. I have to edit on the fly as I do this. So let's see if we can answer one more question. Did the church in Jerusalem practice socialism? That seems like a timely question in light of some things that are going on in our society today. Look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 44. Now, all who believed were together and had all things in common. Of course, that's after the events of Pentecost, after 3,000 were converted to the Lord. Well, I just read verse 44. Verse 45 continues, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. There are those who read statements like this and they conclude that the first century church did indeed practice socialism. Got a similar statement in chapter 4, verse 32. Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And then a few verses later, Luke says, Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and distributed to each as anyone had need. And it goes on to talk about Barnabas having land and selling it, laying the money at the apostles' feet. Then there's the story of Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5, who sold land, pretended that they were giving all of it while keeping back a part of that, and you remember the rest of that story. Well, I don't believe that the church in Jerusalem practiced socialism for several reasons. First of all, Acts 5 verse 4 indicates that what they did was voluntary. Ananias and Sapphira had the power to use their funds in any way they chose. It wasn't forced upon them by anyone. These passages tell us what the church did not what they were necessarily required to do. And then, I think the expression that they had all things in common really means, when you look at all of the evidence, what's mine is yours if you need it. That was their attitude. Also, let me point out that in Acts 2, verse 45, it doesn't say that they sold all their possessions and goods. Now, I recognize that somebody might read what Luke says and draw that conclusion, but Luke doesn't really say that they sold everything. Notice that they distributed as anyone had need. And in verse 44, the verb sold and divided, and this is a little bit of grammar here, I understand that, is in the imperfect tense. And the imperfect tense was used by the ancients to talk about something that recurs periodically over time. So Luke is not saying that on one particular occasion they sold everything that they owned and they divided it among themselves. He's saying that periodically and recurrently, as there was a need, they would sell property and divide it among the brethren. Also, I think it's important to notice that this was an emergency situation. 3,000 Jews were converted on the day of Pentecost. No doubt many of those Jews were from elsewhere. Jews from all over the Mediterranean world came to Jerusalem to observe the Feast of Pentecost. Do you suppose the only converts were from Jerusalem or Palestine? No, I suppose there were converts who lived way away. Well, they needed to be taught. They needed to be grounded in the faith. They needed to be instructed. So they couldn't go back home immediately. Well, they also needed to eat. They needed to have a place to stay. And so, to take care of that emergency situation, the church in Jerusalem sold property, used that money periodically to take care of that need. I'm going to skip that. This guy is just basically telling you what I just said. The imperfect tense is used indicating that this was a recurrent, continuing practice. Their practice was to sell their property and goods and apportion the proceeds whenever a need arose. That's something that is not readily apparent in our English translations. But the verb tense in the original does carry with it this idea. And you've got the same thing in chapter 4. So you've got imperfect verb tenses in chapter 2 and again in chapter 4. Also, only the needy received help, and the non-needy were the givers. Again, you've got imperfect tense verbs. Also, later on, you've got subsequent selling by Barnabas that indicates that they didn't sell everything there in Acts 2. This recurrent idea is indicated in the New International Version's translation of Acts 4, 34 and 35. There it reads that there were no needy persons among them, for from time to time. The translators are trying to indicate the significance of the imperfect tense. I think that means I'm out of time. Okay, well, this is kind of the way it works. And I hope that this will be a study that you will look forward to and that you'll be handing in your questions. Thank you.